prepared and collected. Per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with scions, collected, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. Thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zan I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use scions that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with scions prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. Thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zan I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zan I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use scions that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with scions collected, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is land I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use
Recording in progress.
Good morning, and welcome to the 69th session of the Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. My name is Stella, and I'll be with you for today. The session is being held in English with simultaneous interpretation in French, which can be accessed via the globe icon on the bottom of your screen on the left side. The session is also available live on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. You can ask questions and leave comments in the Q&A box below. To acknowledge our partners and sponsors, let us thank the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew, USAID, Sustainable Nut Initiatives, and Cashew Information. As usual, our host is Jim Fitzpatrick, an award-winning consultant, a business coach, a cashew specialist. He is also known for his ability to forecast the markets and foresee its challenges from a fresh perspective. His experience and knowledge have been gained over 30 years in the food ingredient sector, operating as a major importer of a range of food products and managing sourcing operations for natural ingredients, oil seeds, grains, edible nuts, edible seeds, spices, and dry fruits around the globe. In recent years, he has provided advisory, consulting, training, and food industry for the value chain management in more than 30 countries to a broad range of public and private clients, which include the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, UNIDO, the International Trade Center, the Competitive Cashew Initiative, le Conseil du Coton et de l'Anacarde, CNFA Pro Cashew, and the African Cashew Alliance. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning. How are you? Thank you for that nice introduction, an extensive introduction. Thank you very much indeed.
How are you today?
All good. How are you keeping?
Always a pleasure having you. Always a pleasure having you. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everyone. Hello. You're very welcome. It's great to be with you again. We're going to talk, well, you know what we're going to talk. We're going to talk about cashews. Hasn't this been an interesting time? And I use the word interesting in the usual way that we use it in terms of cashews. Interesting means difficult, confusing. Who could have predicted this recent move in prices up and down? So we're going to try and look at some of the questions that arise from this recent volatility in the market. We're going to look at it in three different aspects. So first of all, we're going to talk about, are these current prices sustainable? Clearly, kernels prices have moved up sharply. Are we going to stay there? Are we going to go up? Or will there be a drop back in prices? And what does happen to demand when prices increase like this, particularly when they go up quickly? Well, let's have a look at what's happened in the past. Let's see if we can get some guidelines on what might happen in the future. Then we look at production updates, interesting news from a number of producing countries. And we'll have a quick look at the impact of the Ivorian export suspension on the market. And we'll finish with your questions. Always welcome. Any comments, always welcome. Join in, be part of the discussion. Before I get started, I want to remind you, looking forward to this event, the 18th African Cashew Alliance Annual Conference. This year in Cotonou in Benin, sure to be an interesting conference. Look forward to seeing you there. All right, so let's talk about prices, let's talk about trade, let's talk about some of the market indicators at the moment. July is an interesting time. It's often a time when, particularly in Western markets, if we talk about Europe and the United States, we're talking about something like about 36% of world demand. It's often a time when decisions are finally made on go or no go on promotions for the rest of the year, and decisions on final cover for the rest of the year. If we look at the farm gate, essentially we see farm gate prices as steady, very strong in India, steady elsewhere. Quality in West Africa, lower. It seems to be getting lower as the weeks go on. That's not unusual. Unfortunately, this year generally it started a little bit lower too. Arrivals are, of course, easing as the year goes on. And it looks like a lower crop. Certainly, that's not news. But still, there's a little bit of uncertainty around it. We think it could be as little as 5% down or as much as 13% down. I'm not buying any of these 25, 40% numbers that people are throwing around. I think they're more about their own books and what they'd like to happen rather than what they think will really happen. International RCN market tends to bear that out. The market's steady. There are, of course, more arrivals at destination and more shipments happening now. More offers in the market too. Prices have drifted a little bit, but few takers. A lot of people are looking at their contracts. They're looking at defaults. They're looking at renegotiation. How you define a default differs one person to another. Some people would say a delay outside of contract is a default, but of course they'll accept it in a higher price market. Similar situation on cashew kernels. Prices have fallen back to more realistic levels, and we'll look at that in a minute. The market is definitely calmer, and I think buyers are much slower to act in this kind of situation. I think that applies everywhere. It probably applies particularly in Europe.
Hi, Jim. Excuse me to interrupt you. We are having challenges hearing you. Your audio is low. We are getting feedback.
Okay. I think the feedback is probably at your end because I was hearing feedback when you were talking.
Thank you.
Thank you. How is that? Can you hear me? Well, I'm not sure if you can, but I'm going to continue. And we've been looking at these market indicator trends. And we've been looking at the major trends in farmgate, international markets, cashew kernels, and the downstream kernels market finally. So in the downstream kernels market, we are seeing some seasonal cooling of demand in China, for example. That may be back later, but we won't know how these markets are reacting to higher prices in key markets in China, to a certain extent in India, where prices are very high right now, and to a lesser extent in Western countries. We'll see the reaction from those countries probably a little bit later, and the big impacts will likely to be into next year. So we do expect price volatility to impact demand, and we do expect it even more so to impact on forward buying decisions, which is a key element of finance in this sector. So we'll have a look then at some of the major influences on the market at the moment. So first of all, the export bans or suspensions have been really in the news this season, particularly in Benin and the suspension in Ivory Coast. There is some uncertainty around the lifting of the ban in Ivory Coast. It was expected a couple of weeks ago. It now appears likely that it will happen in July. We're going to have a little bit of a look at that, not too much detail, but we'll have a look at that a little bit later on. Second factor, the impact of defaults of contract, the impact of delays. So generally speaking, this is causing increases in processor costs. People are renegotiating prices upwards. Some cargoes being resold. There are inevitably going to be defaults on cashew kernels contracts, and that too will have an impact, and that will be seen a little bit later. But there are also delays on contracts, some genuine, some due to market prices, and those are things that we need to keep a close eye on. Some suppliers will negotiate and resolve the problem because there are some genuine difficult issues for processors at the moment. Others won't discuss it, they will just walk away from contracts. Unfortunately, that's what happens. Looking at production, we've seen interesting news from Cambodia. You might remember about a month ago, we mentioned in this webinar that we thought that the Cambodian crop was larger than the initial estimate. Well, the Cambodian Cashew Association has come out now and confirmed that through their estimate, where they've mentioned a figure now of 850,000 tons. That's interesting. That means more cashews in the market, but most of them have already been shipped to Vietnam. Looking in West Africa, it's a little bit more clear now on the actual volume of the harvest, and some of the concerns around the volume have eased, but there certainly are concerns around quality. In most countries, quality is lower than we would normally expect. And becoming more and more an interesting story is the situation in India. At the moment, we're getting a mixed picture. It's very easy in India at the moment to hear stories of problems with the harvest. It's a bit more difficult just to get the straight story on some of the states where we understand there is no problem. So this is interesting, and motivations and reporting, as usual in this sector, are really important around these issues. Demand-wise, well, we've talked about it a little bit. India is strong, cooling in the West for now at least. China, probably business as usual, and in premium markets in the Middle East, Japan and others, generally people are waiting to see what happens in view of the recent price increases, and particularly in view of price rises combined with shipment delays. And whether delays turn into defaults is the key question. So we're talking about, are the current prices sustainable? So let's have a look and see if we can identify where they are, where they've been, and maybe as we go on a little bit of where they might be going. So we've seen this sharp rise in price, and then we've seen this correction, if you like, back to the current levels. So that correction initially from the very low prices was always likely to happen. This overcorrection was also likely, but what really has surprised me is this move from the initial platform around about $3.10 for WW320s. I recorded $3.60, but to be frank, I know people paid higher prices than that in some markets, much higher than that in some cases for isolated contracts. Why that happened is really quite difficult to understand. But we have come out of a period of falling prices. Prices fell from mid-2021 onwards, and prices at that time were, roughly speaking, around about current levels. We then went through a period of stable low prices. So really throughout the second half, in fact really 3 quarters of 2023 and into the first quarter and beyond this year, we saw a period of stable low prices. Now that brings a number of questions to mind. Firstly, how much forward cover was taken in that period, during this period of stable low prices? So to what extent are buyers and processors committed at low prices? Key factor, and we think it's a big number. And why is that so interesting? Well, the failure of those contracts to arrive can cause a second wave of buying. Now, it might be slightly different this time round, in so much as that a lot of these low prices were not passed on to consumers. So retail demand in countries where supermarkets are dominant, which means particularly Europe and the US, these prices may never have been seen at consumer level, and therefore the impact of the rise could be less. Second question, did buyers become more careless on their counterparty risk due to low stable prices? In other words, in a period of low prices, we become conditioned to thinking it's not going to change, and therefore did buyers become more careless? Did they deal with suppliers that wouldn't honor their contracts if the market moved up sharply, as has happened? Why did the market overreact? So this is an interesting question. Why did the market move so far up and then come back so quickly? Is that an indicator of the level of forward cover? In other words, that people are maybe on the one hand not covered, but more likely on the other hand covered at low prices from suppliers that they feel they can't trust or they don't have confidence in? And is this an indicator of where prices can go in the coming months? Allied to that, of course, we've got to ask the question, will these higher prices damage demand in 2024? Will it be like 2022 again, when we saw, for different reasons, mainly economic, a crash in purchasing, a crash in imports in North America and Europe? So that brings us to the question, is it about the price, the actual level of price, or is it the volatility that hurts? And that's something we're going to look at over the next 15 minutes or so. And the final question in this series, of course, is, are the current price levels sustainable? So to answer that, we need to start by taking a look at the history. So let's have a look. So here's a long cashew price chart. We've been gathering price data for many years, and this particular chart goes back to the beginning of 2002, more than 20 years ago. So let's see if we can track the current prices back. So if we take prices now around 325 and we go back over the previous 10 years, we can see that for long periods the price was above the current price, and for long periods the price was below the current price. In fact, if we look at the averages over 5 years, the average price is 287, well below today's level. And of course, the average price over 2 years is well below, as we know, well below today's level. But if we take that a little bit longer, if we look at a 10-year figure, we're looking at prices 340, so a little bit above today's level. In fact, if we look at prices at month end, these are month end prices that we always take. If we look at month end prices, the FOB price of W320s was at or above today's level in 70 of 120 months over the last 10 years. That's 58% of the time. Now, of course, most of that period was in the first half of that 10 years. More recently, it's been well below the current level. So we have to temper the way we look at that. On the face of it, 70 of 120 months means, yes, of course, current prices are sustainable. But then we've got to look at the timing. And so for most of the recent period, so is there a COVID factor in there? Is there a kind of a pandemic factor in there? Key question is, are these prices high? And you probably say they're not. These prices would seem to be workable. Back over 10 years, back over 10 years before that, prices often exceeded these levels. So let's have a look and see, how did these prices impact demand over that period? So first of all, we're going to look at the reaction of demand in the past. And when we look at the global annual cashew consumption, we see that we have seen a steady rise in demand throughout the period. Now, it's been driven by different things at different times. Always present is growing demand in India. More recently, we've seen growing demand in China. In the middle of the period, strong growth in demand in the European Union. So global cashew kernels demand has risen in 12 of the last 14 years. The exceptions were 2020, first year of the COVID pandemic, and way back in 2011, when we had the hangover of the financial crisis. We should also notice that in periods of high prices, looking at 2018, 2017, demand has grown more slowly. Looking at that on a regional basis, again, we see the overall trend reflected in all of the regions. We see a little bit more volatility in India. So India is the lighter blue color. We see a little bit more volatility in India during COVID. We see certainly more volatility in US demand. And we see China apparently responding to lower prices. So there is a little bit of regional variation. But generally speaking, demand has been rising in all regions, and it appears that markets have reacted more to economic conditions, like in 2022, or to crises, like in India in 2020 and 2021, where demand was down, or the opposite in Europe and the United States, particularly the United States in 2021, when demand was sharply up due to the impact of the pandemic and all that went with it. So it does appear right now that demand continues to move up regardless of cashew price. That would again suggest that the current prices are sustainable. Let's look in a little more detail at this. So what we're looking at here is the FOB price from 2010 to 2023. The FOB price of 320s. So that'll always be the lowest price origin in our case, which over this period has mostly been Vietnam. And then the black line is the average annual change in consumption, measured mainly by imports. And what we see is that during a period of price stability, demand tends to grow more quickly, even at higher prices. So in this period when prices were around about the current levels, but there was price stability, we got 16%, 9%, 10% or roughly over that period. Secondly, we see a period of volatility. So in a period of volatility and higher prices, we see slower demand growth. Now, we should temper that by saying in this period, over $4 and higher, the amount of business done was relatively light. So we really shouldn't say, well, this is just simply about price. It's about volatility. Thirdly, if we think about the time lag, there is a time lag when prices fall. So the impact of falling prices takes some time to impact the market, especially in markets where forward contracting is important. But there's less of a delay when prices rise. So in periods of very high prices, we see faster reaction. In periods of lower prices, it takes a little bit longer. I think it's about 18 months reaction time in forward purchasing markets when prices fall, but it could be as little as 3 to 6 months when prices rise sharply, as we've recently seen. So we've seen a number of factors here. We've seen that there is a reaction to price stability, signaling strong growth. There is a reaction to volatility, slowing the level of growth, and this is particularly noticeable in countries with supermarket chains that may not have passed on the lower prices. So the recent pattern, we see this on-off pattern in recent years. So we see early in COVID, falling demand, sharp rise in 2021, sharp fall in 2022, improvement again last year. So this on-off pattern tends to indicate that we might see a slowing of demand, especially in those markets where supermarket chains are dominant, especially in Europe and the United States, in other words, in the second half of 2024. Let's have a look at some other markets. So I've just added in here, same things, annual price, world demand, but we focused in on North America and Asia, excluding India. And what we see is that the US market has been more volatile than the average world consumption in the last 4 years. So that would suggest there's some kind of greater sensitivity to price in the US market. Secondly, we've seen that in Asian markets, whereas there isn't a huge response to higher prices, when we've seen lower prices, looking at the green line, there has been a response. So falling prices prompted more demand. 2022, a typical case, growth levels went off the charts, 23% growth from 2022 to 2023 in those markets. So can we actually say the opposite is also effective? That if Asian markets, for example, have responded to lower prices with demand growth, will they respond to higher prices with falling demand? And similarly in the US market, will we see a decline in demand in the US market quickly because it has been more volatile in recent years? Let's have a look at some other markets. Let's have a look at what I call the fast growing markets, those markets we've seen rise quickly in recent years. Asia, excluding India, China, Eastern Europe, so separating out Eastern Europe from the European Union, and West Asia, often called the Middle East. So these are growth rates, annual growth rates. So if you go back to 2010, you can see China was growing quickly, Eastern Europe was growing quickly, Middle East was growing quickly, and Asia, excluding India, was growing quickly. Let's put in over there the price trend. So now you've got the growth in each of the markets and you've got the price trend. Now I've put in high, low, and average price for the periods. I've put those in so we can get some idea of the volatility within each year. So what we're seeing is quite volatile growth patterns in those markets. We see 3 really strong growth periods. Back in 2010, 2019, just ahead of COVID, and last year. So definitely what we're seeing in those markets, the fast going, what we might call the newer markets, we're definitely seeing response to lower prices. And we're also seeing, if you look at 2017, 2016, 2018, we're seeing growth reduced, even decline in those markets. Will that be repeated? Now, clearly prices are not as high today as they were back in 2017, but they have risen and they are high. So there are indications in those markets that we would see a fall in demand. So we've got indications here that there will be a reaction to higher prices, even though those prices that we're currently looking at are reasonable, workable, sustainable in the overall costing. Let's have a look at Vietnam and let's just test if the trends in Vietnam prove this thinking. So first of all, you've got monthly exports from Vietnam. So back in 2021, you see the usual pattern, market peaking mid-year and then exports falling away. Similar every year. 2022 was a poor year compared to the others. Now, to describe it as a poor year is maybe a little bit unfair. All of these recent years have seen really strong demand for cashews, but 2022 was a year when exports fell back a little bit, and 2023, of course, off the charts, all records broken. Let's put on top of this the prices. So here you've got monthly exports from Vietnam, and you've got the FOB price over the period. So what we're seeing, first of all, is that this period of lower prices from July 2022, when prices started to fall, to the second half of last year when they started to stabilize, that would appear to be reflected in higher export levels. Probably two things at play. One is a recovery from a poor second half of 2022 in the West, but two, a reaction to lower prices in markets. And let's have a look at some of those markets. So bearing in mind our price and export chart from Vietnam, we looked at North America, the top 9 countries in Europe, that's where most of the imports go. East Asia, excluding China, the Middle East, top 6 countries in China itself. And what we see in 2021 in blue, 2022 in orange, and 2023 in grey, what we're seeing is that 2021 was a really strong year, but it was followed by a poor year. So in North America and Europe, we saw imports decline sharply. In Europe, they recovered in 2023, but not quite in the United States. So the US improved, but didn't recover to the levels of 2021. Europe did, but in the other three, East Asia, the Middle East, and China, we saw improved demand. What was different? What was different is lower prices. So we have the impact of inflation, uncertainty in the economy in the Western countries, impact of lower prices of cashews in these three key markets, and what are becoming more and more important markets. So we're still asking the question, will higher prices now change these trends? That's a difficult one to look at. But what, for example, is different now? So what's different in 2024 to periods back, if we look when prices were last time very high back in 2017, even 2019, what's different today? Well, there is one significant difference, and that is related to production. So we've come out of a period when supply and demand was relatively closely matched. Yes, there were surpluses some years, there were carry-out stocks some years, but we're now in a period where since 2021 there has been a fundamental surplus in the market. 2021, 2022, 2023, of course, it's much more closely matched now. In the initial year, there was a demand spike. So in 2021, there was a strong demand spike in the West, particularly in response to lockdowns. That was followed by an economic slowdown, so demand slipped back a bit. And then last year, we saw lower prices boosting demand. So what's really different is this. Over 10 years, the growth in supply, taking into account particularly what I call the production surge in Cambodia, we see a 6% growth in production, but that over that period was only matched by a 4% growth in consumption. If we were to do the same figures and stop at 2020, we would see that supply and demand growth was much more closely matched. In fact, there were periods when demand was growing more quickly than supply. If we look at the 5-year, so compound annual growth rate is what we're looking at, over the 5 years, what we see is that supply has been growing much more quickly than consumption in that period. So that is different now. We are looking at a fundamental position of surplus over those 3 years. Now it's different this year because, of course, we know production is a little bit lower. By how much, we're still trying to figure out, but it is lower. So when we look at this, we see fundamentally different supply-demand conditions now. Supply has grown more quickly than demand since 2019, and that's reversed the trends of the last 10 years. And looking at the current growth picture, that's not going to reverse until around about 2028. So let's have a look and see in the different markets how that might show. So first of all, looking in India, the largest market in the world, about 37% of cashews consumed in the world are consumed in India in 2023. Demand is expressed as demand for raw cashew nuts in international terms. The market's been growing at 4.3%, about 25% faster than the global average. And India needs about a 1% growth in production worldwide every year to meet its demand for raw cashew nuts. Indian production hasn't been growing in recent years, so demand in India, supply in India is a key factor in determining where the balance goes and of course where the market goes in the longer term. Let's have a look at Europe. So the European market is about 74% sourcing from Vietnam. African sourcing has grown in recent years, about 17%. Over 10 years, the European market has been growing at just over 4% each year. It's a little bit slower in the last couple of years. There's a nature of business in Europe is that there's a heavy forward cover dependence. The market itself can be difficult to access because of requirements on issues like food safety, certification, and increasing buyers' requirements in that market. And it's a mix of direct sourcing and importers. We'll have a look at the United States market. 89% dependent on Vietnam. Again, heavy forward cover is an important factor in the market. People do buy in North America and in Europe 6, 8, even more months forward. Growth in North America has been much slower than elsewhere in recent years, only 2% over the last 10 years. The penetration of African processors into the North American market is also lower, only 6% market share in 2023. Most imports into the United States are managed by importers. That's an important factor to remember. It has a major bearing on how the market reacts when prices go up or when prices go down. We'll have a look at China, dominated obviously by Vietnam for geographical reasons. As we can see, about 95% of China's cashew consumption is sourced in Vietnam. Growing quickly, 9%. Forward cover is not important. So people tend to buy, not quite hand to mouth, but they do tend to buy a little bit shorter contracts. A year forward is not a typical situation as it might be in Europe or in North America. In the Middle East, increasing penetration by Vietnam, about 50% in the top 6 countries. The rest is mostly Indian production, mostly looking for high quality, and about 6% share for African processors in that market. It's a premium quality market in many cases, and forward cover is less important. So the big thing coming out of this, when we look at consumption, Western markets, North America and Europe, forward cover, high dependence on Vietnam, good growth rates in Europe, low growth in North America. Eastern markets, China and India. In China's case, forward cover is not important. In India, completely different. Demand is not actually expressed in terms of buying of kernels. Kernels imports is not allowed, although it does happen. Demand is about raw cashew nuts. But India is growing quickly, the largest, the fastest growing of the 3 major markets. And in the Middle East, we have seen less importance to forward cover, more interest in premium products, and often prepared to pay higher prices for the products that they want in terms of quality. So very different markets, and we will see different reactions in those markets to defaults, to delays, and to price rises. So let's look at actors, and let's see how might these price changes impact different actors. We'll start with roasters. So let's start with a roaster. I haven't covered everyone in this. I've just taken some examples. But let's talk about a roaster in Europe or in the US. So what might the reaction to higher prices be? Well, it might be to scale back purchasing. If not to buy less, then to buy more carefully. They'll certainly be checking the supply chain, looking for who's reliable, who's not. Some will be forced to renegotiate. Certainly there's likely to be a delay taking forward cover. Maybe a look to see how is this going to work out before they take any further actions. And I think we're seeing that already in the market. Definitely, and I think especially in the United States, roasters, packers, snack manufacturers will be looking and seeing, can we use more almonds? Can we use more pistachio nuts? Can we use more peanuts? All three grow within the US. Less default possibilities on these products, less supply chain disruption on these products. People might look at them as just simply more reliable. Let's look at processors. Let's look at processors in India. So processors in India, in fact, we'll put up Vietnam as well. Let's just contrast the two. So in India, processors generally, because exports are not a major feature of the market anymore, they generally don't have huge forward sales commitments. Some processors are going as far as to resell their raw cashew nuts and just shut up the shop for the time being. And that can have an impact on small and medium processors, less on larger processors, but it can be a factor. You can turn your RCN around, lock up the shop and walk away. That's happened before in India. I think it's happening to a certain extent in this year. A little bit different in Vietnam. Generally businesses are larger and generally they have forward sales. So there's going to be renegotiation and delay, but it's on both sides. So if you're dependent for about 80% of your raw material, I think it's 83% last year, imported raw material. And if a lot of that, about 52% is coming from distant markets in Africa, which have been disrupted, you're negotiating on the one side with the supplier of the raw cashew nuts, and you're negotiating on the other side with your customer for cashew kernels. One is looking for a higher price or an extension of the contract. The other, at least initially, is going to say, we don't accept extensions, we don't accept price increases. We need to work something out here. And there's significant jeopardy there. So the first reaction, I think, from processors in Vietnam is somehow, can we keep the RCN market within reach? In other words, can we somehow maintain the calculation that you can buy raw cashew nuts and make some kind of a profit out of the processing? Or can you ensure that the contracts that you've bought are delivered? And that's been difficult. And it's been difficult because of market increase, but it's also been difficult because of the crop. And it's also been difficult because of some of the policies that have been introduced this year. Third group we look at, and I was one of these at one time, importers. Generally speaking, if we look at kernels importers in markets that trade forward, margins are relatively tight. You know, your profit margin can be less than the movement of the market over a couple of weeks. So importers in those markets are faced with a difficult situation. They've demanding customers on one side, and on the other side they've suppliers. That's why earlier I mentioned this thing, whether or not people became less careful in choosing suppliers during that period of low prices. And there has been, especially in the US, a push over the last 10-15 years for lower and lower prices. That puts importers in a very tight spot. So they're going to have to renegotiate, they're going to have to price average, they're going to have to defer delivery. Now you do see different strategies adopted in this. I mean, this is about, for some it's about survival, of course. So some will defer contracts, some will deliver some of the contracts they get, sell others in order to price average. That definitely happens. Sometimes their customers will know about that, sometimes they won't. Some importers have developed strong supply chains, even participating in processing. So they do have better options. But generally speaking, the kernels importer in those countries is really highly exposed in these periods of price volatility, particularly price rises. Oh, and by the way, some of them are no saints either. They'll renegotiate the opposite side when prices fall. That happens too. And that leads to a pattern of tit for tat default renegotiation year to year on the one hand, and it leaves a legacy of unresolved disputes in the market over a longer period of time. A bit different for kernels importers in markets where there isn't this forward trading, Middle East, for example, or China. And in those cases, you would expect that it's business as usual. Just respond to demand trends. If the market is $3.20, so be it. Let's see if our customers want to buy at that price, and we work away. But with importers, and where the more important importers are, the more difficult it is to judge how the market goes, because they will react according to their own risk, according to their own forward positions, and according to their own commitments. So let's try and sum up some of the things that we've been talking about what happens to demand when prices rise, or more particularly when prices rise sharply as they just have. Well, firstly, I think historically we can say that kernels prices are sustainable at the current levels. And I'm talking about Vietnamese prices, you can talk anywhere from 325 to 340 at the moment for 320s, and that would appear to be sustainable. Higher end of the range, you're looking at 340 as the 10-year average, but that should be workable over the long-term period. But it's not as simple as looking at the history. There is a big impact of defaults, delays, and renegotiation of contracts. Even if the prices are sustainable, this factor will certainly put demand growth in jeopardy looking forward. Higher prices are highly likely to delay forward buying, especially for 2025. Now imagine the scenario. It's February 2025. The market for 320s is $3.30 a pound, let's say. There is an enormous crop on the horizon. Cambodia is going to hit 1 million tons. Cote d'Ivoire is going to go back to 1.3 million tons, and everywhere else is looking good too. Would people buy in that environment? Would they like to have their books full in that environment? Probably not. I'm not saying that prices will crash. I'm not at all saying that. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying the prices are sustainable, but I am saying that decisions and demand growth is put in jeopardy by the current situation, more by the default, delay, renegotiation and volatility than by the actual level of price. It can also have an impact in markets where forward cover, and I'm making a distinction here between markets where forward cover is important and markets where forward cover is less important. But it can also, higher prices, as we've seen, can hold growth in markets like China and the Middle East, simply on the basis that, from what we see, lower prices stimulated that growth in the first places. In India, the biggest market, higher prices seem unlikely to impact demand directly. India seems to be resilient in terms of its demand growth. The only negative periods were during COVID, when distribution was halted, processing was restricted, but the higher prices could have an impact on processing in India. Restrictions in the supply of raw material might cause small and medium processors to close the shop, sell the RCN, and come back next year. That is a possibility. I think it's happening in some cases. Conclusion would be that if we were to see further price rises, so if the market bounced again back toward this 360 level, and even beyond that, as we saw in some cases, I think there would be a significant reaction. So what I'm saying is, fundamentally, these kernel prices are sustainable. Fundamentally, that correction was always likely to happen. There doesn't seem to be much that is negative toward the maintenance of these price levels in the short term. But we will see some impact on demand, and that's most likely to impact in the market in 2025. It may be difficult to make forward sales in 2025. Now, that's really essential. Forward contracting is a fundamental part of finance in the cashew business. In Vietnam, in West Africa, having a forward contract is important. It's important to source finance. So that's an area that we, over the coming months, we're going to see an impact of. Whether or not this demand will run out quickly or slowly remains to be seen. We're not seeing the reaction to higher prices at consumption level just yet. We may see that in India from August onwards. We may see it in China from perhaps September onwards. In the West, I don't think we're going to see an awful lot of reaction at the consumer level, but I think we will see at the roaster importer level. More conservative policies, less forward buying, a lot of residual disputes and delays to be resolved. So let's move on to the second part of our discussion today. We're going to have a look at production and supply. I'll give you a few numbers and we'll talk about a few issues. First of all, let's have a look at the latest Vietnamese import figures up to the 15th of June. We'll have full June next week. So we see really strong imports into Vietnam. 9% up on last year. Really good numbers in terms of imports, mainly due to increases in imports from Cambodia, but it looks pretty strong. Let's have a look at exports from Vietnam, and again, very strong figures. So we're seeing remarkable export performance really over the years so far. These numbers, it's 30%, 29.84 I think is the number from Vietnam Customs, but it has been slowing. In May and in the first half of June, it was well below the average for the year so far. And what we're seeing is, in particular markets, is that shipments to the US and China are slowing. So if we look at the cumulative figure, so on the left you have simply 5.5 months exports for 2 years, and then you have the month of, or the half month, 1/15 June for 2023 and 1/15 June for 2024. Not much difference between the 2 years, only 7% difference there. And then if we look at the cumulative, so this compares the bars monthly exports cumulative, so they add up month on month up to the 15th of June, and then the comparison with each of the 3 most recent years. Again, we see every month has been well ahead. In fact, the gap was growing up to April, and it's now beginning just to ease back a little bit. And thus we're getting a slower growth in May and the first half of June. So it does make us look a little bit again. Now we know that early in the year there was an interest in shipping early, and that was to avoid some of the delays caused by longer transit times and shipping delays. So could it be that the early season shipments that were undertaken in order to avoid shipment delays actually end up meaning that some of these buyers holding greater inventories are less impacted by defaults and contract delays? Does that sound like another year? It sounds very like 2022. And there we have to place a red flag on demand right now, because if this is like 2022, then this gap is going to close as the year goes on. We have a look at the RCN stock. Now this is calculated. So some of these numbers are absolutely accurate. Some are calculations by me. Opening stock, including the work in progress, about 300,000 tons. I'm saying the crop is 320,000 tons. I've seen 300. I wouldn't argue with either number. Imports, we know what they are. Interesting, imports of Burma kernels are sky high this year. So this is the RCN number. All these numbers are RCN, but I've seen figures from Vinacas on the Burma kernels, that's the on-peeled kernels, in kernel tons, and just converted it to RCN. Exports and a little bit of domestic consumption. So opening stock plus the crop plus the imports of Burma kernels converted to RCN, less the exports and domestic, gives a balance of about 640,000 tons, about 2.3 months processing stock based on the average for this year. A little bit less than normal, I would say. A little bit less than is desirable, I would say, but nonetheless, as of 15 June, it would mean 15 July, 15 August into September, and there lies the question. Is there enough material coming? Is there enough material available to hit the market in that period? And there's another question. Who does it belong to? If it belongs to processors, that's one thing. It can come to market. If it belongs to traders, well, you could see a little bit of a squeeze developing in the market in Vietnam, and product held back in order to be supplied later in anticipation of higher prices. So let's look at some of the key factors here. So if we look at the imports from Côte d'Ivoire over the first 5 months of the year, we see that imports were down by 43,000 tons. This was more than made up for by imports from Cambodia, which were up a remarkable 230,000 tons on last year. Obviously here we're talking about Vietnam Customs Agency figures. We're talking about the official numbers. Looking at exports and converting the increased exports, and bear in mind, for 5 months it was up 30%, a little bit less than that now. But to end of May, about 190,000 tons was lost. So 190 out, an additional 230 in, and a shortfall of 43. It almost balances, interestingly. So this crunch time comes now. July, August, the shipments that would have been expected from Côte d'Ivoire will be missed due to the export ban. Now the export ban came in early in May. So we know early May is July arrival, probably end of July arrival, so we're probably talking about August and September processing. So we don't actually see the shortage expressed in kernels terms until August, September, I would argue. Some processors may say it's July. Now if we look at that, what we're seeing at the moment, a lot of concern in Vietnam about this, but it is in anticipation of a shortage rather than an actual physical shortage, according to these figures. So the supply position will tighten due to a lack of arrivals from Côte d'Ivoire, but there is enough stock from now. Key question, who holds that stock? Is it in the hands of processors? Is it in the hands of importers, traders? Then we start to look at exports. Will exports continue to fall? We saw a slower May, we've seen a slower first half of June. Neither of those figures was impacted by higher prices. So if we see seasonal slowdown from the Chinese market, for example, which has been strong this year, and we see a less buying interest, people will want their contracts executed, but they may not be coming back for more. Will we see exports continue to fall? Will it turn into 2022 on exports? Very, very difficult to judge that. But what we're looking at, certainly an impact of a tightening supply situation. But will it be felt at the end of July? Or will it be felt in August. And there is a question, will the kernel buyers really care? Now, I'm being a bit mischievous with that question. There could be a situation where kernels buyers decide they don't care, because in the end, maybe they're not that interested in cashews anymore in certain markets. And that's a question that we really do need to ask. No one needs cashews. Even in India, where cashews are part of the food chain fundamentally, no one actually needs cashews. And what are we doing in a market where we're looking at such a volatile, difficult supply chain? So let's continue and have a look at production trends. We've talked about Cambodia. CAC estimates crop 850,000 tons. High proportion of that is already exported to Vietnam. We know that the gap was made up. Yields were lower in some areas, but we know there was additional areas planted coming on stream. What happens if they come back on stream further next year, but we don't get the impact of poor weather conditions and we get normal yield? I think 2025 could be as high as 1 million tons in Cambodia. It would be logical. Additional hectares in 2024, lower yields. Same additional hectares plus some more in 2025, normal yields, somewhere between 1.3 and 1.4 tons per hectare. That easily gets us toward the 1 million figure. Again, a figure that may have been seen in 2021. It could even be higher. Could Cambodia be the largest producer in the world next year? In India, so India's crop is usually estimated at somewhere between 700 and 800,000 tons. It's been lower, it's been higher. And many opinions that we're listening to, and I get a wide range of opinions. I get it's down by 15%, and I get some people even saying it's down by 40%, which I don't really believe. I think people are influenced by where they live and where they work and where they do business. So you do get some areas officially reporting big losses in Goa, parts of Andhra Pradesh. I've been speaking to people. And then in other areas, you're getting much less impact of the weather conditions. Some of the hot weather seems to be to blame in some of the areas. So I've been reading, it's very interesting in India. Cashews are important. You can read it in the news. You can talk to processors. You can get a pretty good idea. But it's very difficult to get official figures at this time of year. So questions arising. Kernels demand in India remains strong. Kernels prices are at highs. They're remarkably high in some cases. Looks like 320s, for example, are very tight and prices are high. So they won't come for export in the same way. Some processors, and maybe this is part of the reason for a tightness on kernels, some processors have chosen to resell their RCN to other processors, some to Vietnam, and close up the shop, suspend operations, or reduce capacity. That begs the question, is processing capacity dropping amongst the small and medium processors? In India, there are thousands of processors of all sizes. There are some major, modern, efficient factories, and there are other small, old-fashioned factories. Some of them do a great job, some of them not so good, but they are important to the cashew economy. What's happening with them? We would have to ask the question, why are Indian processors, if the crop is so poor, not chasing down international RCN? Demand is good, supply is restricted. If their crop is so poor, why are they not chasing the market? It makes me think that perhaps the crop is, I think, almost certainly down, but that some of these numbers are pretty much exaggerated. And it's complicated by the fact that some people are reselling RCN that they originally bought to process. That often happens, but it's happening quite a lot now. And that may be influencing some of the crop reports. Also, if traders are holding RCN, you're going to get more negative reports, because obviously traders want to buy and sell at higher prices, and one of the reasons that the market would go up is if there's a perception that the crop is lower. So a better situation in Cambodia, Second highest crop on record is likely this year. Perhaps the highest crop will be next year. India, mixed situation, great demand, high prices for kernels. Will they have an impact on demand? We won't know for, I think, 6 to 8 weeks. We could see a short, sharp season. India's seasonal demand peaks in October usually. And we're seeing a complicated situation, which could have fundamental influence on the future, particularly of small and medium processors in India over the longer term. That's India, Cambodia. Let's look at the world's largest grower of cashews. Let's look at Cote d'Ivoire. And so many people are talking about what's going on in the country. So many people have talked about the export suspension. It is a suspension, it's not a ban. And what happened? Let's just try and figure out what happened. So export was suspended in May. This was done to allow some struggling processors to buy. You would have expected that farm gate prices would fall. They didn't. They went up, which doesn't seem to make any sense. But quality fell because obviously the whole process of assembly and shipment was interrupted. The infrastructure is not yet as it might be. And obviously you get a fall in quality. You always get a fall in quality due to the nature of the harvest. But you get it in this situation. Farmers encouraged to hold on a little bit more material in the country to be stored. And of course, that safety valve, the cross-border trade, which from the Ivorian point of view is illegal, the cross-border trade increased and material moved into neighbouring countries. June 10th, this suspension was lifted for stocks in warehouses. This was estimated at the time to be about 165,000 tonnes, most of which have been sold already to buyers, processors primarily in Vietnam. But exporters were told that they must sell a number that 18% is the number quoted, about 30,000 tonnes, at a price that was arbitrarily fixed at CFR 455, about 750. It wasn't a price that pleased the exporters. It wasn't really a price that pleased the processors either. Some of them felt it was a little bit too high, and the processors that perhaps were the target of this measure were the ones that would struggle most to make money at those prices. So the fact was that most processors, most well-organized, well-funded, well-managed processors were already covered, if not for everything, for most of their needs by that stage. The processors who were suffering, or maybe not suffering actually, from the reduced crop, because the entire processing capacity this year is likely to be somewhere in the region of 325,000 tonnes processed. The crop, the lowest estimate of the crop, is 1 million tonnes. It still leaves quite a lot of material in the country that was coming in this time. So really, maybe what this was about was the inability of some of those processors to buy in the market. That wasn't helped by the suspension. In any case, all processors were given access to some of the exporters' stock. Exporters generally, maybe some didn't do this, but generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that they did what business people will do. They offered the lower quality to processors. So this effectively meant that the price, the 455, was a higher price because the quality offered was lower. I've heard reports, average qualities, 44, 43 pounds. Better than some of the material around today, but not as good as processors would have expected when this measure was introduced. Bringing ourselves up to speed on this, up to July 2nd, it's been reported that the processors, at least those who can buy, have bought. In other words, the measure has run its course. Therefore, we would expect the next news to be that the export suspension would be fully lifted. That was predicted by some people to happen in early July anyway, But if those processors have bought, there doesn't seem to be any reason to continue the export suspension. So the stocks can move and what's left in the country can move. It is lower quality, and that's a factor. We have seen prices slip back a little bit in recent days, partially related to the quality. So in that period, what happens? So the warehouses are full. That ties up a lot of cash. Normally, exporters would like to rotate their money, so they would like to sell their stock, buy another batch, sell that, and go again. Quality is damaged, quality is lost. Contracts have been defaulted. Now, many people could do nothing about it because it was a government regulation. But nonetheless, from the buyer's point of view, that might be just seen as a default. Reputations have been damaged. And clearly, regulation after the contracts have been done is really bad for business. So really what's happened here is that probably for reasons to support the domestic processing industry, and it is valid to support the domestic processing industry, but effectively what you get is a small group of processors, probably underfunded, probably not as well managed as some of their competitors. They tie up $1 billion export business, which is RCN from Côte d'Ivoire, for 2 months. Not good. That aspect of it, not good for anyone. Now, some processors may be better off as a result. Time will tell. But there are questions to be asked. How will this work out next year? Will buyers trust Côte d'Ivoire for forward contracting? Possibly in 2025. We don't know, of course, but there could be a bumper crop. So you could see a situation next year where you have a big crop, excellent conditions, and difficulties selling it. There's also an outside chance that if this ban isn't lifted quickly enough, and if the conditions for lifting it are not clear, there is an outside chance that there could be unsold, low-quality cashews left in the country at the end of the year, and that is not good for anyone. So this needs some resolution at this point. Governments do what they think they have to do. There's no doubt about that. Governments normally do that with the best interests of their country in mind. Whether or not they're fully informed when they make those decisions is often a question that we ask. We're talking about production and supply. Let's continue. Let's have a quick look at West African production. Not a lot of change in the story from Nigeria. Still figures 300,000 to 400,000, a wide range. This material flowed in from Benin due to the export ban. There we go, export bans again. Local reporters told us in the last week that they thought 200,000 tonnes had been exported and that processors had bought 60,000 tonnes. That's an expansion of processing in Nigeria. That's good news for the Nigerian economy. Elsewhere, Ghana, not really any change from the last time we were chatting on these subjects. Benin, exports still not permitted. They've happened, of course. I wonder, has the government accepted that illegal exports cross-border are going to happen? It can't be controlled. Maybe they'll have another go at controlling it next year. But it does have the look that not many people are happy. I don't think processors are happy in Benin. I don't think exporters are happy in Benin. I don't think the processors in India or Vietnam that buy the raw cashew nuts are delighted with the fact that they now come through Togo or through Nigeria. There's added cost everywhere. Difficult season. Let's see what happens next year. Burkina, not a great deal of change. Definitely production is well down according to reports. The supply of raw cashew nuts is limited. Guinea-Bissau, more news. Arrivals are slowing according to reports. It's raining, which would be slightly early. The narrative has changed. So the narrative has changed from good quality, maintaining the crop size, shipments are happening, to, oh, now we have a shorter crop. Now, I'm a little bit cynical about some of these things, and I'm going to say, has that narrative changed because the stocks of RCN are in the hands of the exporters? Or is it the reality? Or possibly has more material moved into Senegal in the meantime? We're going to investigate that for the next time we're with you, and we'll have a good chat about Guinea-Bissau when we come round again. So as usual, we did a little bit of a look at what all of these things mean. So we're talking about more production in Cambodia, increased crop estimate, and we have reduced crop estimates in India, Benin, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Guinea-Bissau, but none of them hugely yet. India is the biggest one. The others, we already anticipated that. And this puts us, best estimate is a 4% reduction on last year, which is, in terms of volume, is neither here nor there. You could add significantly to that if you then say, well, wait a minute, we've 4% less, and our quality from West Africa is well down. That means fewer kernels. That number could be 6, could be 7% if you factor that in. Look, on the pessimistic side, 13% down in terms of volume. Again, obviously, lower yield factors play into that too. So now we're looking at a crop which we think is probably somewhere in between the two numbers, but probably more towards the 13% down. Is that a huge factor? We're in July. There's been heavy shipments. The market's gone up. There probably isn't a huge amount to play out on that, but there is one factor that could really change this situation, and that is what happens in India. What is the actual crop outcome when all the data is gathered? So that would change. If India were at the worst possible forecast that we've heard, that would change this estimate as low as 24% down on last year. Now, I don't believe that, but it is spoken out there, and we may be wrong. I think it's probably going to figure out at about 10-12% down this year. A lot of that's factored into the market. It has had an impact. But a lot of the talk and a lot of the rumor is talking about a much bigger impact. Okay, are we missing an opportunity? Well, I was reading the European Snack Association magazine recently, and it occurred to me that there really is an interesting time going on here. We see hazelnuts at high prices, almond exports are down, peanut supplies are down, pecans facing the tightest supply for 2 decades. Meantime, pistachio nuts exports soaring, and they had a short article in there too which says Europe shows little appetite for cashews. I'm not sure about that, but even so, there may be an opportunity. So while we're talking about defaults, we're talking about export suspensions and bans and policy, and we're talking about quality, and we're talking about inability to evacuate quickly and efficiently from the farm gate, there does seem to be a pretty good opportunity in the world market. What is the cashew sector going to do about it? That question's been asked for many years. So the key points from today, from me, from us, we think cashew kernels prices are sustainable at the current levels. We think that the demand growth is likely to be slower this year. We think that forward buying will slow down. We think that that will reduce the access to finance come the new crop in Northern Hemisphere next year. I don't think it'll have an impact on the Southern Hemisphere, Tanzania, Mozambique, Indonesia, Brazil. Unlikely to have an impact there, but certainly next year, West Africa, possibly Vietnam, it'll have a work. We think that Indian production, what it turns out to be, how the market handles it, how the market reacts to it, will determine the next move. We don't think that a big spike in prices will be sustainable. We think it could happen, but it'll be short-lived. Definitely, delays, defaults, for whatever reason, even if it's a valid reason, are undermining the reputation of the sector generally, undermining the reputation of some countries more than others, undermining the reputation of some processors more than others. If people have become more casual about selecting their supplier in a period of low prices, you can be sure they will be more insistent in the period of higher prices and volatility. Next year is when we might see the impact of this volatility. Next year, hopefully with good crops, you could see a situation where there's a major surplus, something like 2021 again. We won't know what that means for some months, but it is something that's on the horizon. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and let's go back to Stella for see if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the insightful presentation. We have delved deeply into today's topic, and it was insightful as usual. Now, dear participants, it's time to answer your questions and bring up your contributions. To facilitate this part of the webinar, I would like to welcome the co-moderator for today. Many of us know him already as he is a familiar face and he has been moderating the GME since the beginning of the year. However, today I would like to take this opportunity to introduce him more fully. He actually has extensive experience in the cashew industry, holds postgraduate qualification in agricultural economics and organizational development. Throughout his career, he has worked with several banks and development corporations, contributing significantly to various supply chain interventions. Notably, he has served with the Netherlands Development Corporation. Shall we welcome Ernest, the Managing Director of the African Cashew Alliance?
Thank you very much, Stella. Today has been this kind of extensive introduction of us, but it's a pleasure, Jim, to see you and also to hear from you the presentation you have made on markets and prices, and then also on the IBC situation, the impact of the ban. Let me first of all ask you a question which has to do with the data you were presenting on the markets and prices. And the question is more about, for the prices, how large is the pool of processors you are basing the quotes on? This is what a questioner wants to know. How large is the pool of processors you are basing your questions on? You are basing your quotes on, sorry.
The price data that we've been gathering since 1996 is gathered from not just processors, it's gathered from processors, roasters, importers, development organizations, trade associations, and it's tested against import figures. So the number of people that contribute, including brokers, I shouldn't forget brokers, although I would like to, you're running into hundreds of people over a long period of time. Not everyone every month, but a wide network. If you'd like to contribute data to that, you could do that by joining the Cashew Club on LinkedIn. It's just a LinkedIn group. Anyone can join, and you can put some data in there if you like, or you can send it to me directly. All contributions are always welcome. Yeah. Ernest.
With the second question wants to know, with little processing taking place out of Vietnam, where are the Burma kernels coming from? Is it IVC? And that the figure appears to be too high.
IVC, Mozambique, Nigeria, and smaller quantities from other countries.
Okay. Now, regarding
by the way, the figure is the Venacast figure.
Okay.
Just for clarity.
Yeah. Regarding the world cashew production versus consumption, you mentioned Cambodia's high planting maturing as the key driver for 2021-2023. And the questioner wants to know, would it not rather be due to the growth in IVC?
Sorry, I don't get the question.
Jim? Hello, Jim?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ernest, but I don't quite understand the question.
Okay, so the questioner wants to know, regarding the world cashew production versus consumption slide you presented, you mentioned that Cambodia's huge planting maturing as the key driver in the 2021-2023, because you talked about the situation in 2021 and 2023, and said that Cambodia's huge planting maturing was the main driver for that period. The questioner wants to know whether it will not rather be the situation in the IBC where production seems to have grown tremendously in the period you mentioned. This.
No, let us look at production in Cambodia. So I'll put that slide back on.
Yeah, so maybe if you can go back to that slide, you were attributing the growth in 2021, 2023. I think it's a slide on world cashew production versus consumption.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at Cambodian production and let's look at the growth in Cambodian production. 2020, 200,000 plus. 2021, 1 million tons plus. This is the big growth in the period. So Cote d'Ivoire may have grown from 920,000 to 1.3 million, but Cambodia grew from below 300,000 to 1 million and then settled 600,000-700,000 tons. So that makes it the primary driver of production. Cote d'Ivoire is a contributory factor. Cote d'Ivoire was the primary driver up to that period, but Cambodia took over in that period. Now, what happens in the future remains to be seen, but indications are that there'll be further growth in Cambodia. Ernest.
Yeah, with the estimated drop in production in Cote d'Ivoire from about 1,250,000 estimated to about 1 million, is this going to upset all the calculations you have done about Vietnam having surplus of even about 2.3 months so far? And how do you think this will?
No, all those numbers are factored in there, and like we've spoken about that during the presentation. So the question remains that, well, number of things. If you were with us 2 weeks ago, we think that the 1 million ton estimate is low. We think it's a minimum of 1.1 million tons, and that's based on trade figures as opposed to crop estimates. I'm not sure that there is a valid crop estimate in Cote d'Ivoire, i.e. a scientific one, and for perfectly understandable reasons too. So based on trade figures, we think that the crop is 1.1 million, maybe more than that, number one. Number two, in calculating the balances in Vietnam, it would already be factored in the trade figures. So it doesn't obviously factor in what hasn't happened. It only factors in what has. And then we asked the question, will the shortage, and we're focusing specifically on the ban. So the ban was in place for 2 months. Someone needs to mute there in the panelists. The ban was in place for 2 months. So the impact of the ban is to delay the delivery of a lot of that material to processors in Vietnam. The question I asked was, will that impact in the month of July or in August or in September? And the conclusion we reached was that it will be probably in August and early September when we express it in terms of the availability of kernels. But that today, there shouldn't be a major shortage. But then I asked the question, well, who owns the raw cashew nuts in the country? And I'm asking that question openly because I don't specifically have an answer to it. Ernest.
Yeah. Then the other question has to do with the share of Africa in the consumption in the different parts of the world. And the questioner wants to know whether this share is growing or stagnant, because you seem to have given those shares for a situation probably now. But then is there any growth over the period, or it is stagnating in the last few years?
Well, we looked at this in one of our earlier webinars, and as we get towards the end of the year, we look at it in detail again. So I think if you go back 4 weeks, maybe go back to webinar 5 or webinar 6 of 2024. You'll see the detail on it. There is growth. There's significant growth in the market share in Europe, particularly within the European Union, 17% in 2023, and it has been growing. In the United States, 2023, there was a 6% share for African processors. That has been growing in volume terms. In 2023, it didn't grow in market share, it actually dropped, but the imports had increased from 2021. So generally speaking, there's an increase, fast in Europe, steady in the United States, steady in another market which is of interest for African processors, the Middle East, where it has about a 6% market share. I think we mentioned that on one of the slides too. So African processors share is significant. It's growing. Unfortunately, in the early part of this year, possibly due to crop delays, we have seen it slow a little bit in the European market, but I would expect that will be rebalanced as the year goes on. So very positive trends, even in a difficult season, and Africa's processing share in the key markets is increasing. Ernest.
2 more questions, and the first one is, what is the quality of Cambodia's harvest? Which kind of a growth there?
Cambodia's harvest is reported as good quality. Cambodian nuts are average yield around 50 pounds plus. Average size is, they're large nuts. You can get 120 count, but generally speaking, large nuts, large size, good quality cashew nuts. Maybe some concerns on the peeling characteristics of Cambodian nuts. We'll only really know that when we see more nuts processed locally in the country. They're often finding their way to markets in China through Vietnam, where they're shelled and sometimes sold as these unpeeled cashew kernels, large size. Generally good quality. This year's quality was on average as good as any other year. I don't think we've seen particular quality issues in Cambodia. Interesting aside was that there is more drying of the nuts in Cambodia this year than previously. Previously, everything was going out as wet to Vietnam for processing. Ernest.
Thank you. Then the last one from Devendra. You had mentioned earlier on that Vietnam has a stock of about 2.3 months coverage of RCN. And then his question is, how much is current stock for kernels in the EU, US, and how long will this service the market?
Okay, it's a moving target, first of all, because bear in mind that every day something is imported, every day something is consumed. I don't have a measure of what roasters have in their warehouses or importers. What I would say is that the early shipments of this year to both of those key markets were very high. People wanted to build an inventory in anticipation of longer transit times, difficulties shipping. They've done a pretty good job of managing that. Importers in the US and in Europe, they built up an inventory to keep themselves going. I haven't heard of too many problems. I have heard of 1 or 2 people struggling for supplies, but often because they didn't recognize that there would be issues in the market this year and missed the opportunity on that. I don't think there's any difficulty. I do think that the stocks that are for sale in both markets are very limited, simply because people have been looking at delays in shipments, and therefore obviously they're going to take delivery of spot goods or even buy additional spot goods as necessary. So I don't think that there's any kind of a critical position in terms of inventories in either market, but I do think it's quite tight.
Thank you so much, Jim. But before I come back to you for what to expect in the next weeks, and also to talk about when we have the next GME, let me take the opportunity to acknowledge our partners who have supported us and made this possible. We're talking about the European Union, the OACPS, GIZ, MoveCom Cashew. We're also talking about the USAID and the Sustainableness Initiative. Thank you very much for your support to enable us to bring this to our viewers, our listeners, and to the cashew sector globally. And also don't forget the next ACA annual conference is from 17th to 19th of September in Cotonou, Benin. And now, Jim, over to you. What should we expect in the coming weeks before the next GME on the 31st of July, 2024? Jim?
Thanks, Ernest. The talking points haven't changed that much from the last time. First of all, keep a close eye on the reports of the crop progress in India. Well, I think in most places the crop is coming to an end or has come to an end, so there should be more information coming out. I don't think it's going to be particularly great news, but I don't think it's disastrous either. We will get some indication of the response of demand to higher prices. I don't think that will be negative. What's more important is the impact of negotiations on contracts, potentially defaults. RCN shipments and prices, we should see more shipments. We hopefully will see a situation where Côte d'Ivoire thinks that it's time to lift the suspension and exports can return to the market. I wouldn't expect that to have any huge impact on pricing, simply because I think it's already factored in. And in the longer term, I think we might see that many kernels buyers start to look more closely at West Africa as a source of supply in order to balance their dependence and balance their sustainability profiles in sourcing their cashew kernels. No doubt it's going to be an interesting few weeks. I'll be watching it closely. I hope you do too. And I look forward to talking to you again about that towards the end of July. Thanks very much. Thank you, ACA. Thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, Stella and Ernest. See you next time.
Thank you so much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Thanks to our participants, interpreters, to my co-moderator, Stella, thank you so much. And bye-bye, and see you again 31st July 2024. See you soon.
Recording stopped.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is land I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zan I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is land I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zion I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now